It's a, I could have said this earlier, it's a landmass that's almost equal in area to the 48 US states. So it's a large landmass with only 20 million people really just ringed around the coast.
Here, I wanted to comment on one of the bridges we talked about, not totally.
Okay.
But you know, you said the word bush, they really don't use in Australia. Yeah. It's hard to define. But you know, I've been up to Canada a few times, north of Lake Superior, and they use the word bush, where we would say I'm going out in the woods for a few days. They'd say, well, going out in the bush for a few days. So they use the word a similar way, I think.
Yeah, they do. You're right, and I had forgot about that, but I'd known that at one point. Thanks for pointing that out. Antonio.
I don't know if this relates to literature or not, but it's a curious question that I have. Do Australian females call one another mate, just like the males do?
Do Australian women call each other mate like men do? I always get nervous when my wife's in the room and I'm answering questions about Australia. It's sort of ridiculous because, as you can imagine, if you were, somewhere in a foreign country and someone asked you a question about the United States, it's not like you're really just because you're from the United States, you don't know everything. But she makes me nervous in these occasions. Do Australian women call each other mate? Some do, yes, but it's not all that common. And the ones that do are genuinely looked upon as being what Australians would call bogan, or we would call redneck. Is that fair? Yeah. Or they're really old. Yeah, for some, older women, they get a little rougher or something.
It seems like the association to the bush and the rainforest and the desert all seem like they're very harsh. Are they all very harsh to live in and travel in? Are they hard to get through?
Australia is not a great country for settlers. It's a hard country to live in the way that Europeans are accustomed to. The indigenous people of Australia were nomadic, even at the time that Europeans first colonized the country. And that was an entirely sustainable way to live in that country. To actually set up an establishment, it's a very difficult country to do that. Rain is incredibly unreliable in pretty much all parts of that country with the exception of the rainforest. So, yes?
How heavily are the forest areas utilized, like economically? Is it like all the industry gets pushed into like these small forested areas and like get these less vegetation? As far as like woodcutting and like grading and crap like that, are they like chopping them up basically?
No. I mean, a lot of the Australian economy is based around mining right now, as I said earlier, and that's taking place in areas where they're not cutting down forests because it's out in the desert, though of course they're still devastating the landscape in other ways. There's not very much logging in Australia because there are not very many trees to log in Australia. You'll find that most Australians, one of the things that Australians are fascinated with when they come to the United States, I know my wife was all the wood houses. Look at all the wood houses. Australians have brick houses. Sand is much more plentiful than wood. So there's not a ton of logging. In Tasmania is the one place where they log extensively.
What is the mining? What kind of mining?
Pretty much anything that you can imagine, from gold still to uranium to lead to natural gas is really big right now.
If we look at a lot of settled countries, what you see is that maybe and I've noticed, if you can correct me, there's that many of the natives of the area would latch on not only the landscape but also the animal life as something for sharp imagery, and settlers more as a challenge rather than that sharp, respectable imagery. Do you see anything like that in Australian literature?
I think definitely that definitely the early Australian writers were writing about Australian landscape as a challenge. They were colonizing that landscape, claiming that landscape as their own, and it was something to overcome. Consistently, that was how they were writing about it. The Aboriginal people in this early period that I'm talking about in the 1800s or early 1900s, yeah, the first book of the first book by an Aboriginal person published in Australia was published in the 1960s. So it was very late. So the Aboriginal people didn't have a written culture at the time of colonization, so we can't exactly say how they were writing about it. But white Australians have shifted in the way in which they write about that landscape. From the let's colonize that landscape, it's a challenge to overcome, to, in more recent times, it's something that's special, unique, different, something to be valued, treasured, cared for.
Specifically with animal imagery, though. I think actually a lot of your readings really did say a lot, just really reflected exactly that for the landscape. I'm just kind of wondering if there's that.
But animals?
Yeah, living on that landscape, if there's something that's happening that had to do with it.
That's a good question and not something I've really thought much about. I know that there have been quite a few Australian writers who've written about the Tasmanian devil because of its status as an endangered or extinct species. Extinct? Extinct, right? The tiger is extinct. The devil is still around. I always forget. Thank you. Other Australian animals, I couldn't say exactly. Certainly in the early days, they were fascinated by kangaroos, right? Marsupials. The early explorers were writing a lot about that. I don't know about any more.
What about Aboriginal peoples? Was that ever part of their literature? Or?
Yes, definitely. I didn't delve into that topic today. The connection of Aboriginal people to their landscape is a ripe and fruitful discussion, but something outside of the scope of what I wanted to go into. Yeah.
How would you Australians see the British royal family? I think the Queen's there right now. Do they write about her, or do they just tolerate?
Well, they had a public holiday because the Queen arrived, so everyone had a day off. Like everybody at every place of employment had a day off because the Queen landed in the country. So that's an indicator of how they feel about her. She's a great excuse for a day off. She is still the Queen of Australia. She still holds that title as the head of state. And the royal family is a subject of fascination amongst Australians, I would say. It's something that's always in the tabloids. You know, Australians can name all of the cousins and et cetera of the royal family, and they talk about them, and I have no idea who they're talking about. Yeah.
Here you said that Ireland was settled. Did you mean by England?
Yes, sort of.
There was a very strong indigenous population there. They were more likely invaded by England.
Well, yes, they say, right, a term that's used is settler colony, but invasion is probably a more apt description, yes, in a lot of circumstances.
Norwegians settled a lot of Ireland.
I should know that, Elf, because we share a good Norwegian heritage, but I'm afraid I was ignorant of that fact.
Before we insult any other nationality, perhaps we should wish our guest the best and thank him for a wonderful lecture.